So I'm really happy to be here with you guys today. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. So I'm Dr. Tequilla Brownie. I am with TNTP. You saw my bio. I've been there about 6 years. But I want to tell you a little bit about me before, the real me, right? Not just the one that's in print on your in your program, just so you can understand kind of the context that I'm coming from and what the values are that drive me as I speak. So you see kind of at the top some of my educational experience. I like to highlight Rivercrest School District. I actually live in rural Arkansas, and Rivercrest was my high school. That was my school district, and people always ask, oh, you know, how did you like Yale and UT and all that? And I'm like, I love them. I had a great experience, but I bleed red and gray, which are the colors of my high school. I mention that because I went through public education in Arkansas. I was raised by my sharecropper grandparents, who you see here. So for the first 11 years of my life, I actually didn't even have indoor plumbing. So I wasn't able to invite friends home from school, friends from school, home with me and have sleepovers or anything like that, because I was obviously very ashamed that we didn't have the resources that some of my friends had. But my grandparents, who did not have were able to complete high school growing up in the Deep South, actually instilled a lot in us about the value of education. They knew that when they dressed me in the morning and sent me off to school, they were literally trusting my very life into the hands of my, guess who?
Is that okay?
My teachers, exactly. They knew that for my story to be different from theirs, for me to have more, for me to not have to use an outhouse, they knew that I had to complete my education. And so when they bundled me up and shipped me off, fortunately for me, they shipped me off to my school district, Rivercrest, where I did get the opportunity to graduate, ready to compete with students coming from Choate, Exeter, all of the prep schools across the country that you name. Remember, I just came from, a home, barely just got in the bathroom, let alone was able to compete with those students who had far more resources than my family had. But I made it, actually graduated right on, along with everyone else, on time, with honors, all that stuff. And again, so imagine that journey from outdoor plumbing to, at that time, the #1 college in the country. That was because, I'm not bragging on me, don't take it that way. I'm bragging on the teachers and the educators that literally set me up for success. And that's the dream. That should not be the exception to the rule, should it? So my little hometown of 700 people in Joyner, Arkansas, I shouldn't be the only one that was able to capitalize on the American dream. That's the passion that I have and bring to the work, because I don't want my story to be just, oh wow, she did great and that's the exception. I literally want that for every single child, black, brown, white, Hispanic, every nationality, every race, every socioeconomic status. This is one of the first times in our country's history we know our children have a risk of not doing as well as us. So for me, the little guy you see here on the right, that 9-year-old Markel, who has big dreams, he was a little bit upset with me that I was only taking him to Mexico for fall break and not Dubai, right? Yes, thank you, that was my reaction as well. How many of you have been to Dubai? Great, I have not yet, and I'm so I might take myself before I take him. But I'm glad he's not limited by what he sees. Markel is my adopted son, so at 2, he was living in an abandoned home with his mother. So imagine that journey now from homeless to he expects to go to Dubai. He actually thinks that my standards are too low because that's not my goal right now, and he's assured me that he'll take me once he gets some money. So I'm so fortunate and thankful that he's not limited by his means. You see pictured my husband, Derek, actually got married this summer, and my husband is a retired military first sergeant, and his upbringing is much like mine. He grew up in urban poverty. So he grew up in Indianapolis, I grew up in rural Arkansas. Our stories are so similar though, both raised by our grandparents, did not have the best foundations. He grew up in the projects around a lot of crime, a lot of rural and urban poverty. I describe them as close cousins, right? They're just a little bit different outfit, right? But again, was able to attain his degree and have a very successful career in the military. And he's retired now, right? And he's not 50. I'm so jealous. I'm like, I didn't do something right. So career-wise, you saw in my bio some of the things I've done with the school district, with TNTP. I didn't mention I also am a school social worker. So when I think about the work that we do as educators and the paths that we lead and what our students face on a daily basis, that my background, I didn't teach in the classroom until only at the college level, but as you can imagine as a school social worker, and especially in the elementary and middle schools, the types of experiences that I saw with my students and my parents. So let's get to the opportunity myth. This is TNTP's 6th national report. And at TNTP, we're really focused on not just like publishing reports and looking at ivory tower things and, oh, look at us, but we actually get in the work with our clients, with our district partners. I was appreciative of Superintendent Brownie was there with his district when we did some of that work and shared those findings, and appreciated his boldness in embracing what we found and not kind of brushing it off or making excuses for it, but literally saying, okay, what can we do and what do we need to do differently, and let's get to it. When we, on this particular report, lots of research is focused on teachers, right? Teachers, what are they doing? What are the adults doing? What are teachers doing? What are principals doing? We decided one of the best ways to really, really understand what was going on in our classrooms was to understand what students were actually experiencing. And how often do we do that? Not too often. Do we ask, let's go straight to the source, right? And so for this report, that's exactly what we did. We actually worked with 5 school systems across the country. They were diverse geographically. They were diverse from a racial, socioeconomic status. And these districts, actually 4 school districts and 1 CMO, we actually followed 4,000 students. We collected over 1,000 hours of observations, full-length observations. We didn't want to like pop in and just, guess what we saw. We, looked at full-length observations. We looked at 5,000 student work assignments to see like, what are kids even being asked to do in those classes? And then we looked at 20,000 examples of student work based on those assignments. We even surveyed students. We collected 30,000 real-time in-the-moment student surveys to get the idea and get a clear picture of what students were experiencing in the moment in those classrooms. And then we also surveyed and did focus groups with the teachers involved in the survey. So what we found is that one of the things we know is that all students, really, the majority of students, regardless of who they are, actually intend to go to college or beyond. And we found that even 70% of high schoolers have a concrete career plan that they know is going to require them to have a college degree or a post-secondary degree to actually complete. So one of the conversations that's been going on is around, are students, who's at fault? Like, are students doing enough of what they need to do? How many people have heard of the achievement gap? So I like to say we've sort of been navel-gazing at the achievement gap, right? For decades, like it's been inching, we'll make a little movement, slide backwards, but haven't successfully closed the achievement gap. That I'm not trying to insinuate none of us are working hard, because I know we are, right? But we haven't quite cracked that nut. We haven't quite closed the achievement gap. So when you talk to a lot of people, they'll say, oh, the kids don't want to learn, right? You heard that before? Oh, the students, it's the Wild Wild West. Heard that before? What we found is that in our research, and you know this, in many classrooms, students are actually doing exactly what they're asked to do. So in our research, this actual specific study, we found that about 88% of the time, students are on task. They're doing exactly the work that we're asking them to do. So they're not running around. I'm not saying that there are some classrooms that's not happening, but that is not the majority of the case. Not enough to account for the achievement gap that we had. 71% of the time, the same students who are on task are actually doing the work that we give them. They're completing their work. They're giving it their best shot, and making good grades, decent grades. 83% earning A's, B's, and C's in ELA, and 78% earning A's, B's, and C's in math. We should be in good shape, right? We should, right? Hey, If kids are actually, they're in school, they're on task, they're doing what's asked and making decent grades, we should be A-okay as a country. But we're not. And so for us, we said, well, why not? What we found is that even when students are actually doing what their school asked them to do, so we said 71% are actually succeeding on their assignments, but when you look at those same assignments, flip that number, only 17% of those assignments are actually at grade level. So that means that students are actually meeting grade level standards on 17% of those exact same assignments. So this means that even though students are actually meeting the demands of their assignments, they're actually earning A's and B's, they're not prepared for college level work. I want to pause here for a moment and connect to just our conversation, and I'm glad that this group, we're not going to argue about standards or all those pieces, but I want to share with you, like, I actually have had people say, well, all kids aren't going to college. Why are we talking about that? You heard that? College isn't for everyone. You heard that one? So here's two pieces that I want to just kind of, for me, this is how I put that conversation to bed with those that I hear that I don't always agree with about that. Two pieces. One, who are you to decide what students need or want, right? So here students are telling us that they actually intend to go to college or beyond, and 70%, this is at high school, so these aren't kids who are saying, oh, I want to be a neurosurgeon, but I'm not going to school past high school. Right? These are students who are well aware. They know that their career aspirations are going to require them to have a post-secondary degree, and they still have that aspiration. So that's one piece. So that's the college piece. The other piece is that when you think about, for us at TNTP, our focus is on making sure students are college or career ready. We have a lot of, my husband himself, he went into the military originally after high school. He completed his, worked in HR, completed his bachelor's degree later, and then became a teacher, a JROTC teacher after that, here in Florida, actually. He's still trying to get us to move back, so, to move here. So again, lots of people take different career paths. Careers are not linear, so we want to make sure that our students are set up for whatever path that they choose to do. Some data for you to note here, given that, we found that about 47% of all kids, of all high schoolers that go to college are taking remedial courses. And then of that, 60% of all students that are African American or Hispanic are actually taking remedial courses. So that's in college. When you look at employers, so let's talk about college or career readiness. So that's our students that are on that college track, they're going to college. When we look at the career readiness factor as well, 42% of employers say that graduates, high school graduates, lack the skills to do their job straight out of high school. Listen to this one. 81% of employers say that students lack basic written communication skills. That means 19% of students have basic written communication skills when they leave high school and go straight into the workforce, based on what employers are saying. So what does that tell us? Students are doing what we ask them to do. They're on task, making decent grades, but we yet have the opportunity gap, and our students are not actually set up for college or career. The opportunity myth for us is this false promise that if students do what they ask to do, they'll be successful. And if they don't succeed, whose fault is it? It's theirs, right? But it's not. It's on all of us, not just teachers, principals. It's literally on every adult in the chain to make sure that students actually are set up for success if we're going to upend the opportunity myth. So then the question becomes, well, how do we do that, right? I think about some of the situations my own students when I was a social worker were facing, and it's like I would have loved to take them home, right? There are lots of things that parents and families can do, but then it's a lot on us as educators. I did a lot of work in Memphis around teacher effectiveness. That was one of the big pieces of work that I led there, and I used to get questions from our teachers, from the union, community members, just asking, well, what about the parents? What about poverty? We can't boil the ocean, right? So as a social worker, I learned there are lots of things that predict student outcomes. The educational attainment of the mother, that's a big predictor. gender, the zip code, poverty status, like all these predictors, right? So those are what I like to call home-related variables that we can't necessarily, as educators, do something about, right? So I can't go just take my student's mom and pluck her with a degree, and that's going to give my student a better chance for success. But what we can control are the factors, what I call the school-related factors. And we know that the quality of education, the quality of the teacher is one of the most effective things that we can do to improve student outcomes. So then the question becomes, well, what do we need those teachers to do, right? Here's what we found in our research. Our research showed very clearly 4 resources that every child needs and that actually is going to give them a far better chance of being successful. So consistent opportunities to work on grade-appropriate assignments. You're going to dig into these more. I'm going to talk about these at a pretty high level now, and then in your breakouts, you're going to go deeper into them. But I want to introduce you to them and just make sure you are clear on what are the 4 things that we can do, some real solutions in order to upend the opportunity myth. So again, consistent opportunities to grade appropriate assignments, strong instruction, which means where students are doing the cognitive lift, they're doing the thinking. Teacher's not in the front of the room giving the answer before any student has the chance to get there. Been in any classrooms like that? It's like, wait, you want to say, let the student try. Deep engagement, and this isn't just basic engagement, this is like students actually thinking that the content and the things that they're learning are interesting, are relevant, are going to be helpful to them in their long term. Remember, they have goals, they have career aspirations. And then the last one is teachers who hold high expectations for their students. This is just basically saying teachers who believe that their students can actually meet grade level work. So what we found, though, in our research is that unfortunately these resources, the presence of them, is too absent. It's far and few in between for most students, particularly for students of color and for students who are from low-income families and who are English language learners and who have mild to moderate disabilities. So we're not giving access to the 4 resources enough to any student. It's exacerbated for students who are part of those populations who are already our most vulnerable. So if you think about the amount of time that students spend in their classroom, and then you look at how much time they're spending on assignments that aren't actually grade appropriate, students are wasting, and I don't like, that's not, to me, that's not spending, that's like just burning it, like, right, setting money on fire and burning it. Students are wasting 530 hours of approximately 720 hours in their core classes. So they might as well just be coloring, right, or drawing. One thing I should say, I like to weave Q&A into this discussion and not just at the end. So as you have strong reactions or questions as we're walking through this, jump in, because I want this is hard to digest. For me, as a woman of color with a 9-year-old son, who's a black male, it's hard to digest, right? For us as educators, it's hard sometimes to digest. We didn't necessarily set out to find some of the things that we found in this study. So even for us to even have to address, we've had to have some internal kind of face tough conversations, right, around equity and around the consistency and what we're giving access to. So when you think about this time, what comes to your mind? So the study was we actually went through all grades, through 3 through 12, and this is actually classes that are the core classes. So in the study specifically, we primarily were looking at ELA and math. So let's look at one of the things when we talk about grade appropriate assignments. What does that mean? So this was an 8th grade classroom in one of our districts that was sampled, a general education class. This was the assignment. They actually were reading the text A Mighty Long Way and had a pretty, I would say, a decent focus question, and here's their assignment, which was basically to write an informational essay analyzing these historical events, getting a chance to really meet the depths of those standards and to learn some relevant content. If you're not familiar with the book, A Mighty Long Way is about the Little Rock Nine. So decent lesson, what do we think of this lesson? 8th grader, read a text about some real history, historical events, and write an informational essay. So before anyone jumps in, I want to show you same district but a different 8th grade classroom, but also general ed. I want to show you one of their assignments. This is actually a story about the Billion Oyster Project. Don't know where it comes from, maybe Pinterest. The story is actually a 5th grade level text. Remember, these are 8th graders, general education. And do you see one of their assignments? Can somebody just read and tell me what that assignment was? Superintendent Brownie, you have a nice loud voice. Can you see that? I mean that in a very flattering way. Can you see that assignment?
I can.
Can you share the room? Can you read to the room what that assignment is? I want everyone to sink in for everyone what that assignment is.
Well, the assignment is to fill in the missing vowels in the words.
What do you think about that? For an 8th grade general ed classroom.
If I ever went into one of my classrooms and found 8th graders doing that work, I would get involved with it. That's unacceptable.
Thank you. How many people are parents in the room? How many people are parents of a student above kindergarten? How many people in the room would be okay if your student came home, I have a 3rd grader, with an assignment that was to fill in the missing vowels of the word. In this case, it was habitat. How many would be okay with that? I don't see any hands up, right? But this is going on. This is 8th grade. If my 3rd grader comes home with this as his assignment, I will be calling or texting Ms. Woods and let her knowing I'll be there in the morning to have a conversation for my 3rd grader, let alone an 8th grader doing this level of work. And now, you might ask, oh, Dr. Brownie or Tequilla, is this just an outlier? Was that just in one? Yeah, I'm sure you just saw that once, right? What do you all think? This was not an outlier. Unfortunately, we saw this too many times in too many classrooms. The other piece, so that's half of the battle, right? So getting grade appropriate assignments in front of students, that's one very important step, but even that's not enough, because even out of those core lessons, once you get the grade appropriate assignment, you've got to make sure they're getting also getting access to good instruction, which basically means the students, as I said, they're doing the thinking and the cognitive lift for their classrooms. But when we look, as you see, you still lose students along the way. You see only 74 when we get down to the end actually had both grade level content and had the students doing the cognitive lift. So that's about good content and good instruction, and it was absent in far too many classes. So no wonder, right, that we actually found that students didn't view their school experiences as engaging or worthwhile, and it actually starts to trend downward the farther you go down. I had when I was in Memphis, my former superintendent used to say, kindergartners show up to school bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, but then as you go up the grade, that energy, that passion, it starts to just kind of decline, right? So that by the time they're in middle school, they don't even want to come to school. Now we know so we could all get into, developments, at child adolescent development, all those things. But there's also something to be said about what's happening in classrooms when students get there in order to keep them engaged. The other piece that we wanted to look at was actually teacher expectations. We actually surveyed our teachers and we said, do you support your state's academic standards? And just to be very clear, not every state explicitly had Common Core standards in our study. They did have college or career ready standards, which we would say were rigorous standards. So 82% of teachers support their state's academic standards. Many said, oh yeah, I was on the committee that helped write them and I participated this way. But then when we asked them, well, do you think your students can actually meet those standards? Do you expect them to? 44% said that they actually expect students to meet those standards. So it's one thing to support something in theory, right? It's another thing to actually believe your students can actually achieve against those standards. Now again, there's a lot that goes into that. Everything from how we're preparing teachers, our entry-level teachers, how we're continuing to support and develop teachers, how we are giving them feedback, how we are giving them access to good material so that they're not having to work all day, stay up all night on Pinterest, finding assignments like, what was it? The Billion Oyster Project, right? So there's a lot of things that go into perhaps why teachers don't feel that their students don't expect their students to meet those standards, but it's a big driver. So you might ask, well, do these 4 resources really matter? How do you know that they really matter? So in our data, we actually calculated student growth and looked at how much students' academic achievement outcomes improved when they had access to the 4 resources. So for all of our students in the sample, all 4,000 of our students, we found that they actually improved 1.7 months more than students who did not have access to grade appropriate assignments. So that's almost 2 months worth, right? In a year. So if we remember, as we talk about the achievement gap, you're making up time, right? If you're going to close it, you got to catch up. So it's really not enough to get like a year's worth of growth in 1 year. If you're going to close the achievement gap, you got to make up for lost time. Students actually who had access to better instruction grew 0.2 months more than students who didn't. Students who were more engaged grew 2.5 more months than students who were not engaged. And then this last one, students who had a teacher that had high expectations for them experienced 4.6 more months of growth when compared to their counterparts who did not have access to a teacher with high expectations. I want to pause here and hear your reactions to this. Was this surprising to any? Is this data surprising to anyone?
I think it is very confirming that teachers also need the opportunity to calibrate and get in to see other classrooms and modeling, because it's hard to get that up to those higher expectations if you've been operating at a certain level. So the opportunity to really get into classrooms that are models and have that collaborative discussion, planning, I think is essential to the process. So the PD aspect of it is certainly a great link.
Here, I have a comment here in the front.
Thank you. Thinking about how do we quantify higher expectations. It's one thing to look at rigorous on grade level work.
I think you have the executive summary. If you go to our website, you can download the full report, totally free, totally there. So you can actually see how we actually measured expectations. But think of it in a nutshell, the question that I said, you believe in higher standards, do you expect your students to achieve against them? But we can actually share with you the surveys, the tools that you can look in the fuller report and the technical report, and when you go to that breakout session, we'll talk a little bit more about those tools. But the best way, you've got to ask. So for us, we asked teachers, do you expect your students to actually achieve against higher standards? And what we found in this data is that when students actually had access to a teacher that did have high expectations for them, they improved more than students who did not. So you might say one of the things that we've heard is that, well, teachers they're differentiating, they're actually making the lesson more accessible to all students, right? Because my students come to me behind, so I'm going to use the phrase dumb it down. I'm going to water it down a little bit so that to make it accessible. That sounds like a notable effort, right? You're trying to make your lesson accessible for students who come to you already behind. Like if I heard that's like, okay, well, I get it, right? Because those students can't do higher level work. So I've got to, lower it for them. Well, in our study, for students who actually start out below grade level, so these are the very students you're trying to make the work accessible for, when those students who already are at least below grade level, what we found is that if they had more rigorous assignments, they grew almost 7.5 more months. If they had stronger instruction, 6.1 more months, more engaged in class, 0.9 months. And if they had a teacher who had higher expectations, they grew 7.9 more months than their counterpart students who were below grade level who did not have access to a teacher with higher expectations. So as a social worker, I kind of can feel the weight of that in the room. You all feel that? What are your reactions to seeing? These are the students these are our most vulnerable students, right? Because they're already behind. We're not giving them access to strong assignments, strong instructions. We're not making sure they're engaged, and we're not consistently holding them to higher expectations because we think we're doing them a favor. But we're in fact doing them a disservice. Comment, yes.
Hi, I was wondering about the stronger instruction piece of it, which I believe is about the students carrying the water of the thinking in the class, and how it was so low in the last one, but much more impactful in this one. And I was wondering if you could just talk about that difference and also why it was so low in the previous slide.
So thank you. So the question, I don't know if you heard, is basically just looking at the impact of students when they had access to the 4 resources compared to students who were below grade level. So the first slide represents all students in our study. The second slide represents students who are already below grade level. So what this shows us is that the very students that we think we are lowering our bar for in order to make the lessons accessible, we're actually doing them a disservice by not giving them access to the 4 resources. So it was the 2 different samples, and we didn't necessarily expect to see this much of a difference or between students who were the whole sample of students, all 4,000, and then just those who were on grade level. But again, it debunks the notion that students who are below grade level can't do grade level work. Would you all agree with that? I think that that's true. So let's dig a little farther. How often... Oh, we've got a comment here. Sorry.
Yeah, I have a question. So about the better assignments, when you talk to teachers and administrators, do you feel like teachers really understood that they weren't giving assignments that were related to the standards? And if not, why? Or do you feel like they don't fully comprehend the standards?
So it was all of the above, I would say. In lots of cases, I think it's Superintendent Browning mentioned in his district, his teachers thought they were doing grade level work. They did not understand, because here's the one thing, standards are not curriculum, right? Correct. Do we all understand? Standards are not the curriculum. You've got to both adopt and implement your curriculum with fidelity if you're going to make sure that students have access to these. That's why for me, it's like when someone said, oh, the new governor in Florida, like they're getting rid of Common Core. I'm like, okay. As I understand it, he's very much committed, and you can look at the bills, committed to making sure that Florida has a college and career-ready workforce, right? There's no way to get there but for having rigorous standards. So again, let's figure out the standards, fine, but standards alone don't do the job. You've got to then make sure you have the curriculum materials, the supports, and all those resources to undergird that work. So if we did nothing with standards, that's why it's like I wanted to just be very kind of direct and say, let's not quibble over that. If we kept the standards as they were, but still we're not providing students with access to the 4 resources, guess what's going to change? Nothing, right? So some people said, well, how often are we making sure that students have access? And are we making sure that we're equitably doing that, right? And so in our study, we actually found that success rates on grade level work, so that means we gave you access to grade level work. How often did you do well on that? So 56% of the time, students of color had success on grade level assignments. 65% of the time, white students had success on grade level assignments. So that's not too big of a difference, right? So decent amount of time when you gave them access to grade level work, they actually could do it. But then when we looked at classrooms that were different demographics, what we found is that 4 out of 10 classrooms that were majority students of color never received a single grade level assignment. Almost 40% of classrooms with the majority of students of color never received a single grade level assignment. Now you might ask, oh, but Tequilla, it was August, and so we're just getting started and we need to know. So I remember I told you, we followed our students. We didn't just pop in August. We were there throughout the year. So I would argue that if you started in August and you said, oh, my students aren't ready, all they can do is habitat. And then you get to the end of the year and you're still having them fill in, I don't know, pumpkin. You're having them fill in missing vowels. That's what we found too far and too often. Yes, in the back.
Yeah, so is there a connection between getting grade level assignments and what teachers believe about what their students can do? Because when I hear that, I get like a pit in my stomach thinking about.
You should.
And I'm just wondering, is it because they don't think they can handle that work? I mean, I think it's probably a multiple answer problem there, but I don't know. What are your thoughts?
So that is actually one thing we want to understand more about, why teachers don't have high expectations. Our hypothesis is that there are a few things going on. One is, sure, there are some teachers that just don't think students can do grade level work. We think in some cases, and so they don't provide it. There are some cases where we think teachers are, you know what? I've got a tough job. I'm not going to bother you. You don't bother me, right? I'm going to go easy on you and you'll go easy on me, right? Then there's some teachers who actually just simply lack the skill. So it's a professional development issue. So you're right. We actually think it's a multi-pronged issue why more teachers are not providing grade appropriate assignments. So is this data, because I want to be clear, are we saying so are teachers just giving up on students? No, we think it's a lot going into that, and we need to understand more. We would argue every district, it might be a different root cause, right, that's actually driving that data. So we also found that this inequitable access isn't random. And this was something we didn't set out to find or study. White students and those students that were from higher income families were more likely to be in classrooms that got access to the 4 resources. So students of color and students from low incomes were actually 25% less likely to receive grade appropriate assignments, and they also received less than half the amount of high quality lessons. This was consistent. Whoa. So in classrooms that had at least 75% or at least 75% Black or Latinx students, 66% of teachers who shared the ethnicity of their students had high expectations. So this is the issue we've been talking about, the diversity of our workforce, right, and why it matters. And the latest research, if you've been following that, shows that minority students benefit from having minority teachers. White students also benefit from having minority teachers. So in our study, that aligned with the latest research from other organizations. We found that 66% of teachers who shared their students' race or ethnicity held high expectations for the students, and 35% of teachers who did not share their ethnicity held high expectations. Now, is this saying that we need all minority teachers to teach all minority students? No, because that number is still only 66%, right? When the ethnicity matched. But we do need to set the expectation that teachers hold high expectations for students. So the takeaway here is twofold for us. One, yes, it drives us to continue to address both the teacher shortage and in tandem address the diversity of the teacher workforce. But it also probes us to look more deeply into why more teachers don't hold high expectations for all of their students. So even when we control for prior achievement, low-income students actually had fewer high-quality academic experiences. So this is basically saying even among students who are higher performing, low-income students still spend about a third of their time less with grade appropriate assignments. So if you think about the trajectory of the closing the achievement gap, I showed you the earlier slides that showed the months that you make up, right, when you give students access to those 4 resources. So what we did here is actually extrapolate that to say, because we actually followed for a year, but if you think about the accumulation of that much more growth that I showed you in those bar graphs, think about the accumulation of that over time, and this is where you begin to see us closing the achievement gap. So we actually extrapolated that same amount of growth that we saw for students when they had access to the 4 resources. And look at the trajectory. When they had at least a quarter of grade appropriate assignments, this is how much they grew. If they had less than a quarter of grade appropriate assignments, this is how much they decreased. Now, let me be clear. This is not even saying you had the presence of all 4 resources. You get that? This is just saying, and not even every single day, every single assignment. This is just literally saying, if you do it at least a fourth of the time, right? I even my husband works out every day. I don't join him. But if I work out with him at least a fourth amount of the time that he does, right? So this is a fourth of the amount of time, not every single day, every single assignment. This is what we're looking at, a trajectory of how much students can grow if you extrapolate that out. This is what closing the achievement gap looks like. Reactions here. Questions here. So you see the comment here, the achievement gap is not inevitable. It feels inevitable sometimes, right? I'm going to be honest. When I was in my school as a social worker, sometimes it felt like we'll never turn this around. So I even as a therapist, I felt hopeless some days. But the achievement gap is not inevitable. So the question was, did we control for years of experience? And we looked at backgrounds of teachers, because right, if that was the magic sauce, we could say, oh, this is the key ingredient. But what we found amongst all the variables and all the things that we looked at, it was the absence or presence of these 4 resources that had a statistical significance on student outcomes. So what would it take to actually make the opportunity gap disappear? What would it take to upend, as we like to call it, the opportunity myth? So what we found that classrooms across the country that offered access to those 4 resources had a few things in common. And remember, they weren't in one state. They were literally all over the country, east, west, north, south. So we found that at the school level, they had a consistent focus on a few small academic priorities that represented a high bar for student success. So in other words, a few priorities aligned to rigorous standards. They had a high level of support for teachers in order to reach that bar. In classrooms, at the classroom level, these assignments and instructional practices reflected those high expectations. So in 8th grade, they weren't filling in habitat. Because doesn't that send a message of low expectations for an 8th grader? Who think about it, if I'm an 8th grader, in 4 years, guess where I'm going to be? No longer in high school, I'm going to either be in college, where we know that 40% of students have to take remedial courses, or I'm going to the workforce, where 81% of employers say students cannot do basic written communication. There was a positive, respectful environment where students enjoyed learning, and then teachers believed that their students could actually be successful. So there were some bright spots that we found thematically. So as far as like what do we need to do? So how do we get from where we are now to getting more students access to the 4 resources? We said what we found are 2 big commitments that have to be present to literally upend the opportunity myth. We said every student must have access to the 4 resources consistently and on a daily basis. Every student, irrespective of their race, irrespective of their learning disability, irrespective of their language, first language status, irrespective of their socioeconomic status. And we have to know that. One of the things, again, I applaud Superintendent Brownie. When we went in, we didn't just pop in that once. Oh, okay, you told us that's it. What I think it was Winston Churchill. Y'all help me. That said you can't inspect what you expect or measure. If you don't measure it, you can't improve it. Loosely, help me out. So you've got to consistently follow up and make sure that it's consistently happening, that students are having access to those 4 resources. The other commitment we found is that families have to be an authentic partner in their students' educational experience. So why did we go here in our data? Remember, we're sending home A's and B's to parents too, right? We're telling our parents, little Johnny is doing just fine. He's making all A's and B's. He is ready. And then what's happening? Little Johnny graduates from our high schools. He ends up in that 40% track for remedial courses or that 81% track of students who lack basic written communication skills. My brother-in-law is a welder. He brought home one of his welding certification books. And I started, flipping through it. I politely set my Yale degree to the side and handed him his certification manual back. My point is this. Students that are going into our workforce have to do more than read, see, spot, run. When I looked at the rigor required for this welding certification, again, my Yale degree didn't even help me. I was like, here you go. I handed it back to him. My brother-in-law has a high school diploma, but thankfully he was rigorous enough. He understands that and has his certifications, is doing well, can provide for his family. My point is, irrespective of where our students are going, college or career, and our families can tell us about those aspirations, but we have to be partners with them. We can't send home these lies. That's all I can call it, right? If you're sending home grade papers and report cards saying, oh, hey, your child is doing great, making A's and B's, and they're doing well, they're set up for success, and if they fail, it's on them, that's a lie. Many of us believe that these commitments, we believe in these commitments already, right? So when I tell you these commitments, you're like, yeah, that makes sense, Tequilla, sure. But the problem is, in practice, we've maintained the status quo. We keep doing what we're doing. As a therapist, I'll say repeating the same thing and expecting different results is insanity, and that's exactly what we're doing. We think we're not a part of the problem. It's the students, it's the parents, it's the families, it's the community, it's poverty. You could go down the list, right? The truth of the matter is we can do something about the opportunity myth. If we give every student access to those 4 resources, we begin to upend the opportunity myth. I'm not saying that those familial factors and those demographic things don't matter. I'm not saying that at all. But within the confines and the control of what we as educators not only can do, but are legally supposed to do, right? We don't get paid to just bring it through and pass it through and, oh, if you succeed, I was a part of that, but if you fail, I wasn't a part of that. You heard some of those stories? Have we ever participated in some of those stories? So what would it mean to live out these commitments? 5 things. So if we wanted to uphold these commitments in practice, what would we be doing differently? 5 actions. We would ask students and families directly about their goals and their school experience. Listen to what they share and act on it. So you've got to bring students and families and parents into the conversation. Second, we'd make grade-appropriate assignments an urgent priority for all students. Third, we'd give all students, especially those who are behind grade level, access to instruction that has them doing the cognitive lift, especially students that are behind grade level. We are not doing them a favor by, I don't know how else to say it, by dumbing down the lessons, thinking that they cannot achieve grade and succeed on grade-appropriate assignments. Fourth, we would ensure that all educators, teachers, principals, superintendents, everybody in the chain had high expectations for student success by seeing firsthand that students are capable of succeeding with more rigorous material. Because if you never give me a chance, how do you know that I can't do it? And too often we saw classrooms where students were never given a chance, especially students of color or students from low-income backgrounds. And then the 5th one is a more macro level action. Do an equity audit. Look at all of the decisions in your district, in your school, all those decisions, both from staff diversity to thinking about who has access to honors courses, who's enrolled in them. Make sure that you don't give some students greater access to the resources than others. Right now, what I want you to do, we're getting ready to transition to our panel. We have some guests with us that are going to help us kind of talk about this. What I'd like for you to do as we transition, they're going to come up, turn at your table, and what I would like for you to do is this. Think about these 5 actions. Think about what gets you most energized, or what are you most worried about at your own district? Like, you know what? I'm really worried. I'm not sure if educators in my school or at my district have high expectations. So at your table, just turn and talk to one of your neighbors and just talk about one of these actions and one of these commitments, what it means to you, and one you might want to think about taking action on. And I'll have our panelists come up while you're at your table talking. I'd love for 2 tables just to share out a big theme or takeaway from your table at your discussion, and then we'll transition into our panel. 2 tables. Over here in the front, we've got, he's bringing the mic, just 1 second.
So we talked about student expectations, and in planning sessions when teachers say, but my students aren't ready for this, really digging in and saying what data is showing you that your students aren't ready for this. How do you know? Is it every student? And what do they need to fill that gap? And I think they're making these generalizations about their entire class that aren't accurate because they're not really digging into the data they need to be digging into.
Thank you. That is a great action step. One more table. One high-level takeaway reaction from a table. Miss Vanessa.
Good morning. We talked about behind a teacher's lack of expectations could actually be a lack of self-efficacy, that they can do it, that they can make a difference. And just like fun fact, in another session, we'll talk about how we believe high-quality instructional materials, if you choose them wisely and use them wisely and implement them wisely, can impact that teacher efficacy in a way that then subsequently impacts teacher expectations and what kids are doing in the classroom.
Snap, snap, wiggles. Thank you, Vanessa. Okay, let's go ahead and turn to our panel now. I'm actually going to allow each of our panelists to introduce themselves. I'm going to ask a few questions of them, and then we're going to open up and let you all also ask them some questions.
Good morning. I am Rebecca Rollerson. I am the principal of Westside High School in Duval County Public Schools.
Good morning. I'm Joy Prescott, the 2019 Florida Teacher of the Year. I'm from Glades County, and I currently teach at a school on the Seminole Indian Reservation called Pimieta Imahaga Charter School.
Good morning. Desmond Blackburn, currently the CEO of New Teacher Center, which is a national education nonprofit, but I've been a Florida resident for 30 years and spent 22 years working in public education in 2 different districts here in Florida. Happy to be here.
Thank you all. Thank you all for being here. So I think I'd love to start out by asking our Teacher of the Year, 4th grade, right?
4th grade.
4th grade, our Teacher of the Year. Joy, can you think of a student in your class that you aren't sure about that had access to all 4 resources, whether from you directly or from prior to coming to you? Can you think of a student that you probably received that maybe along the way at kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade, or 3rd grade, you think that they had not had access to all 4 resources when you got them?
Yes, actually, I speak about a student when I travel this year that came to me very below grade level in math, and just a huge lack of self-confidence and anxiety, and which really stemmed from his lack of confidence in math. But so this year I knew I took him under my wing, and I gave him skills that he could use. And I gave him access to that rigorous content, and I would take him to the side, and we would do one-on-one discussions, and I would help prepare him for math discussions that I would put him in so that he would be prepared for that, so that anxiety, he could get rid of that. I taught him how to talk out loud through processes so that he could hear his thinking when it came to a math, and it was definitely obvious that he was not allowed access to those rigorous questions, because they scared him to death. He didn't even want to interact with them at all. But I put them in front of him, and what I would do is I would give him access in the way of, okay, here's this difficult math problem. What do you need? Do you need extra time? Do you need me to read it to you? Do you need me to give you this multiplication chart to access the multiplication part into it? So I would give him the tools that he needed, that he realized, okay, these are some strategies I can use. And he went from barely making a 2 to making a mid-level 3 on his FSA.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Rebecca, I'm going to come to you now, a wonderful principal. In your role, I know you're in a lot of classrooms on a daily basis, and would love to hear how, as you hear the opportunity myth and think about the 4 resources, how are you seeing that play out in your school or in your role as a principal in your district?
I think when this article or this study originally came out in the fall, it made me think. I've gone from being a principal at middle school. I was there for 5 years and then transitioning to high school. So I saw the entire gamut between 6 through 12 and the expectations that we had for our students and what we were asking of them in the classrooms. And I had different teachers that came to my mind immediately on they're not asking enough, they're not expecting enough, they're not meeting the level of the standard to get that student where they need to be. So I'm constantly going into classrooms and looking at my achievement level descriptions and looking at my standards and looking at the quality of text that teachers are using, because I know that if we're not asking the questions at grade level, if we're not using materials that are on grade level or at Lexile appropriate levels for that grade, then we're missing the mark every single time. So again, when the study came out, I sent my ELA teachers an email immediately what is this the next day? What are you teaching the next day? And how do you even know it's on grade level? Not is it on grade level, because we know what the standards are, and we know, through lesson planning and through our professional development communities and planning, we know what they were going to teach. But how do they know that it's at grade level? And what reflections do they do as a teacher to make sure that when they're asking those questions, when they're creating those tasks, are they expecting students to reach the level of standard each and every day?
Thank you so much. And Dr. Blackburn, up until a few months ago, wonderful superintendent in Brevard, one of the things that I appreciated watching you in your role was the obvious partnership that you had with the community as well as with your workforce, your staff and your teachers. So as you think about the opportunity myth and both sides of that coin of these commitments of making sure every student has access to the resources and also authentically engaging with the community, how does the opportunity myth, how did you see it play out in your role as up until recently superintendent?
Well, one, I'll tell you, I never referred to myself as a superintendent. I was an undercover teacher and an undercover parent who had the opportunity to make superintendent-like decisions, right? And so I focused the work from that perspective. And if you've been listening just to this conversation today, we heard our chancellor talk about the new standards that are on the horizon. Very good friend of mine. You heard another good friend of mine, Superintendent Browning, say, pedal to the metal. I don't care about those new standards. We're focusing on the ones that are here today. And then you heard another good friend of mine from TNTP talk about the fact that regardless of the standards we put out there, we're just not giving those standards to kids, right? Mm-hmm. And how many of you are currently a classroom teacher? You're currently teaching. That is your workload. I saw 1, 2 hands. That job is difficult. To say, we need another word than difficult, okay? So I'll connect that to the conversation right here with this young lady around teacher efficacy. The work is really, really difficult. The challenges are mounting. And you know what? Shame on us as systems leaders. Over the last 20 years, we've allowed words like supervision and evaluation to unwittingly take the place of resource and support for teachers. And so tickled pink that I'm now in a situation where I can unapologetically and myopically just focus an entire organization on providing supports and resources and capacity building directly to teachers.
Thank you, Dr. Blackburn. Speaking of which, as you think about the things that we need to do differently, I'll actually start with you. Now, in your role as CEO of New Teachers Center, I know you get to see and work with lots of districts across the country where we're seeing some bright spots, obviously, but we're seeing far too many times where the opportunity myth is at play. So if you had a piece of advice for the leaders here in this room about things that they need to think about either stop doing or to start doing, what would be like one of your first pieces of advice?
If you have any influence, which a lot of you in the room have, at the systems level of the organization, I said something to an entire district 3 years ago as superintendent, and for some reason got in a lot of trouble, but I didn't back down from it, and it was students are the most important factor around here. And as far as all of the adults who work in this organization, teachers are the most important people who work for this organization. And everyone else will have their value determined by the level of support and resources and assistance you give to the teacher. So creating a systemic focus on teachers and kids, I think is a starting step. Being unashamed and being assertive around highlighting, as TNTP does in your work, the fact that we've had systemically underserved populations of students for not decades, but centuries, okay? And we've navel gazed, right, at that. And so being really, really geared up and focused in on breaking down those barriers that exist, not only in the educational system, but I can't be an educator without concerning myself around political influence, economic realities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, impacting the communities that continue to underperform.
Thank you, Dr. Blackburn. Rebecca, in your role as a principal, what would be one of your key pieces of advice as you think about upending the opportunity myth and giving access to these 4 resources? What would be one of your pieces of advice of what we should stop doing or start doing?
As the building leader or a teacher supporter, I think that we have to stop looking at where students are and let that being the indicator of how we're going to plan moving forward. I have conversations all the time. I can see the teachers' faces, and well, they're here. Well, but they're in the 11th grade. But they're here. But they're in the 11th grade. So I was a former math teacher before I became a literacy lover. And I always try to explain it to my ELA teachers, which doesn't go over well because most of them don't like math, is fractions are embedded in slope. When you teach graphing a line, you're going to teach slope, and you're going to teach that it's a fraction. Students struggle with fractions. They will, they have, they always have from my work, but are you going to spend 3 months teaching them about fractions, or are you conceptually going to teach them how to graph a line using slope and what that fraction means in that formula or in that graph? So stop looking at students as if we're going to teach fluency skills for 3 months and then we're going to ask them what the central understanding of a text is. That's not how we're going to connect the pieces. So truly stop looking at, and Westside is a majority-minority school. It has about 90% low SES, Title I school. My last school was a Title I school as well. And the biggest thing is we've got to do a better job of changing the mindset of what a high expectation is. And I think out of the 4 resources, that is the hardest to transform because it truly is a growth mindset or a mindset that we have to adjust.
Thank you, Rebecca. Joy, in your role as a teacher, a current classroom teacher, what advice would you give to other current teachers or to the leaders in this room of what we should start doing or stop doing?
I think Mr. Blackburn hit part of the nail on the head. I feel like this isn't a teacher problem. This is a school district, state problem. And I think we need to treat it as such. I feel like teachers need as much support as they can get because we don't know everything that there is to know about everything. We don't have every standard down pat and what rigor actually looks like. If you come into my room and you see that I'm not teaching a standard rigorous enough, don't walk away and say, you need to be more rigorous. Right. You have to show me how to be more rigorous. If my work, if my curriculum isn't asking enough of the students, I don't put it in front of them because I think, I want an easy day today. I'm not going to ask much of my students personally. I'm not saying that there aren't teachers out there who might not do that. Personally, I would say most teachers, the things that they put in front of their students are things that they think truly is what's going to benefit that student, is what is going to, is reaching that standard. So if it's not, we have to be told. Not only do we have to be told, but we have to be shown. Mm-hmm. And I think the second thing we have to do is we have to, in our schools, get rid of the stigma of that just because I'm coaching you, it means there's something wrong with you. I am a 17-year veteran teacher who I promise you needs to be coached. I want to get better. I want to get better just like the first-year teacher or the third-year teacher or anybody else. So we have to get rid of that stigmatism, and we have to go to instructional coaching look like baseball coaching or football coaching, where you come in and you say, okay, here's what we need to work on. Now let's actually practice it. Let's actually stand up, show me a lesson, show me what that would look like to you, and I will give you feedback based on that. And so to me, that's the things that we need to address.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joy. We're going to open it up now to some questions from the audience. So as you have a question, I think we have some mics floating around. So if you can just kind of wave your hand or raise your hand, ask questions of me and or our panelists.
Awkward.
No, it's called wait time, Dr. Black.
Just wait to get. Someone's going to punch right through.
Yeah, that's right.
Then the floodgates are going to open up.
There we go.
First, thank you. It really seems like some things that came to mind when we went back to like RTI back years ago, MTSS. It's upending. It's really, there's times when the learner has been faulted. Mm-hmm. And it's got to start with instruction, curriculum, environment, then the learner. Because we need to adjust as adults what we're expecting of students. So just the themes throughout, and just thank you to the panel and to hear directly that instructional coaching model and how we need to really focus that way. Yeah. It goes to also opportunities for teachers on that career ladder and abilities to do other things within. So your thoughts on that, of how to give opportunities within the profession, promoting the profession to further what's happening for students. Just wanting maybe your thoughts on that.
Was that a question or comment?
Well, the one thing that your comment and question kind of brought to my mind, we started working in Duval County, I think in 2013, 14. And initially, Superintendent Vitti was the superintendent at that point, and he initially called us and wanted us to help around, think of RTI, so work with for Tier 2 and Tier 3 students, basically. And so we're like, okay, let's make sure you're good on Tier 1, right? Let's make sure you're good, first instruction is there. And we went in and did a diagnostic process similar to what Superintendent Browning described we did in Pasco, and in fact found that good first teaching was not in place. And so some of those things, there was not solid, rigorous curriculum aligned to the standards, that teachers had access to materials and resources on a consistent basis. So you had teachers having to go on Pinterest, on spending all sorts of time, and you can't quality control that. Again, standards are not curriculum. And so as we think about upending the opportunity myth, this is where having rigorous materials is so critical as a first step, because if you don't have that, you're actually setting your teachers up to fail. There's no other way to say it. You're leaving it to chance that they're going to even start with good materials and giving students access to that. Then forget the instruction if the materials are at a second grade level and this is 11th grade work. Mm-hmm. Your expectations are going to show, I expect you to do this second grade level work in 11th grade. And of course, those students are not going to be engaged. So I think how we view it again, you mentioned the RTI. So when I think about that Tier 1 instruction, making sure that you have the presence of all 4 resources, starting with standards aligned assignments and student work, is such a critical first step. Mm-hmm. Have a comment.
Dr. Bruce Jones, who was chair of education at USF's, now at the University of Houston, in his research several years ago, talked about that there was an attitudinal difference between whether or not a child was seen as an asset or a deficit. What were they bringing to the classroom? And so that teaching often followed, depending on that attitudinal idea. Could you relate that to your research and experience up on the panel?
I'm sure the data supports it. I've always found that adult attitude ended up reflecting itself in the accomplishments of the children at all levels of the system, whether from superintendent to building principal to classroom teacher. So I think they're really, really important, the attitudes and the biases that we all have, that we bring to the table. They need to be talked about and discussed, not in a way that creates accusatory environments, but in a way that creates safe space so that we can talk about, because it's obvious, starting from kindergarten, boys and girls are treated differently. Minorities and non-minorities are treated differently, largely based on some of the preconceived notions, prejudice, and biases that we all bring into that kindergarten, classroom. And we need to just be honest about those things and address via coaching and mentorship.
And some of the, when I started talking about this with my current ELA team, we got really involved in for lack of better words, our feelings on, well, this isn't my classroom, this is not going to be me. I do hold my students to the high expectations. So I had to pull out Brene Brown and the power of vulnerability, and we had to really break it down on, this isn't about you. This is about, what are we asking students to do? What is our mindset in the classroom on holding students to high expectations? So we talk about attitudes, and we talk about the high expectation. I think they go hand in hand. And what are we bringing to the table to make sure kids are successful?
And I think we all have blind spots. When I just went to a national teacher conference, each one of us had to get up and speak about something they wish, this is what I wish you knew about me. And as people were doing that, in me as a teacher, I thought, wow, I never even thought about that. And so I think that when we do that, we have to, unless somebody points out there's blind spots, then we don't even know we have them. And so that's where support comes in,
Other questions?
Good morning, Carolyn Nelson Goddard, Florida PTA. I'd like to hear the panel weigh in on family engagement and how they think that could impact closing the opportunity gap.
Well, I'll speak first while our panelists get ready to also respond. We actually think that authentic family and community engagement is a critical it's a non-negotiable if you want to actually sustain the work. Again, the lies that we're sending home to parents right now sets them up to not be good partners with us. Because we're telling them that, oh, your child is doing fine, you're getting A's and B's, when in fact they are not ready for college or career. We are making decisions about students' abilities by dumbing down the lessons and saying, oh, they can't do grade level work. So if we wanted to think about upending that myth, this is why we say that we have to engage families and communities as authentic partners, in part by not sending home lies, in part by talking to them about their aspirations and goals for their children, and then partnering with them all along the way, every step of the way. I mean, I can talk about my work as a social worker, kind of where I spent, that was I got burned out so fast because I, spent all day at the school working with the students and teachers, but there were so many parents I needed to connect with and try to build that bridge. I neglected my own family, right? And we all do those things, but the time of it actually figuring out ways to have parents be more authentically engaged, and not just for show to check off a Title I requirement, but I mean authentically, I know, but being authentically engaged. And so that is something that we actually have to start even addressing and prioritizing. And I know we all try, I know teachers send home notes to parents and send home these, but it needs to be a two-way dialogue. And again, for us, that first step of stop lying to parents, right, about how well their child is doing is a critical first step. And I'll let our other panelists respond as well.
Authentic and sincere engagement, especially our systemically underserved populations, bringing them to the school, right? and keeping in mind that because we've had systemically underserved populations, that many of their experiences don't recall fond memories of the school. So keep that in mind as we engage and we bring them forward, and go out to communities. Ask communities of all walks of life, what do you want out of your school system, and then provide that. All parents are asking for the exact same thing. Because of where they come from or who they are, they may articulate it differently, but if you're truly listening, you're going to hear the exact same thing out of all parents, black, brown, white, affluent, poor, et cetera, et cetera. So really important to engage and make decisions based on what you hear.
I also think we need to talk about what resources as a school are we providing to parents, not just in a newsletter, but online. But how are we truly engaging our parents, and then providing them the tools where they can assist their students at home. You have to engage a parent from the time they're in kindergarten to the time they graduate, and determine what their next steps are. So as a principal, what am I doing? What is the administration doing? And how are we providing resources to support parents in the transition from K-12?
Can I say really, I'm sorry, I apologize. Can I say really quick?
Go ahead.
The expectations we give parents are way out of whack. Something simple as help your kids with homework, that's unreasonable, okay? I'm a parent. And I'm an educator, and my wife's an educator. I have a college freshman and a high school sophomore. I will tell you, and I'm a math teacher, I was tapped out in being able to effectively help my son with math homework way back in 6th or 7th grade, right? And I'm a math teacher. So when we're sending the work home and we're telling parents, you need to read to your kid, what if the parent can't read? You need to help your kid with homework. What if they just can't? Again, educator. My wife's at a conference. My son has a science project in 3rd grade. I'm left to help him. She hasn't forgiven me yet, right? Because the project was horrible. And I did my best. And she won't let me, want me to live it down. So the expectations we're giving to parents way out of whack.
So I'm going to speak just from a parent point of view because this year I have a 3rd grader, and I don't know if it's because of the transition from 2nd to 3rd where it's, I don't know, K1, 2 is kind of fun, and now 3rd grade it's okay, it's time to be serious, or if it's that mom's traveling all the time so she's not home as much as she was, but my son's really struggling this year in school. And luckily, I'm friends with his teacher. And so we have that relationship. Thank God. Because I will tell you that when she calls me to have those difficult conversations, it is easy for me to want to say, I have a wall up. You're not going to say that about my kid. But because I had that previous relationship, and so I think it's crucial for parents, for teachers and parents. Now that I've always known, you always know family engagement, you always have to get families involved. But until this year, I really didn't see the crucial importance of it until I saw my son struggling. And when I saw that, I knew that if I didn't have this relationship with his teacher, that I would be on the defensive end of it. And I can really see the things that she does she truly wants to help my son. And so she is coming to me because she wants us to work together. What can we do together to figure out what's going on with your little boy? And so, she will give me little bitty things. And like he said, we don't want to overwhelm the parent. If we can give them little nuggets of things that they can help with. But definitely what she said as well, different kinds of communication. It's easy for a parent not to read a parent letter or something like that. I don't think we have high enough expectations also for our parents. We just say, they're not going to come, they're not going to show up. So we just assume that. But if I reach out personally to that parent 2 or 3 times before that parent meeting, then they kind of have this connection with me of, okay, she's going to expect me to be there. And so they're going to be a lot less likely to show up or to something like that. So family engagement, I think, is definitely crucial.
Thank you so much, Joy. I think what I'd like for us to, at this moment, we're going to have each of our panelists give one closing remark. But first, I'd like for each of you to just take about 3 minutes and write down one next step, one commitment, one action that you need to take after having this conversation. So just take a second and reflect on what that is. It can be something big, small, bold, or not. But write down one commitment, one action that you want to take after this conversation. Can you join me in thanking our panelists for their participation? Can you also join me? I just wanted to just really thank and give a shout out to our team from TNT Peers here. TNT Peers, can you just stand for one moment and just let the group record see you, please? Shy TNT Peers, could you just wave your hand then and let people, thank you. So we're going to have one final comment from each of our panelists and then close out.
Yes, sir. Yep. I think I have a comment and then a charge, and I never fit within my 60-second window. But what I will say is when we started this work with TNTP last year with the PFIN collections project throughout the state of Florida, and really engaging in the work of what kind of text are we putting in front of students, what kind of questions are we asking, how are we aligning activities to the standards. So we really got deep and dirty in that way of work last year, 2 years ago, 3 years. It's been a little bit. And one of my teachers finally, I think it was in February, looked at me and said, "I'm not working as hard anymore." So my initial reaction was, okay, let's talk about what that means. And she said, the students are doing the work. The students are engaged in the work. The students are having conversations about the work. They're driving what's going on in the classroom, and I'm simply facilitating by asking really, really strong questions and making sure that the text that's in their hands 90% of the time, you've seen the IPG, it's core action one. But, are they... is that text, are they speaking and listening and writing in response to that text the majority of the classroom? And once she set that stage, the students led the work. So I think it's very, very powerful when you finally get to see a teacher go, they've got it. We are holding them to the expectations in which the standards are asking that of us. And so for the charge is just as building leaders, as district leaders, how are we supporting those teachers in getting there? Because I think it's very easy to tell her, this is what I did not see in your classroom, but how are we supporting her and making sure there's that epiphany where those kids really are involved in that work at a complex level, and we're proud and want to make sure that's where they're going.
Thank you, Rebecca.
So I just want to say thank you to TNTP for bringing this information to the forefront, because it was definitely eye-opening for me as a teacher to read this and to really see that data. And the few friends that I have shared it with have also been like, this is stuff that we don't realize and we don't know. I do want to caution you when you take it back to your districts, because it's very easy to see and get defensive as teachers, because we are the ones who are in the classrooms, and we're the ones we're all working, but we're the ones in the classroom. And so it's going to be very easy to put a person on defense. So as you take this information back to your classroom or back to your teachers and your staff, we want to do it, as she said, in a way that we can say, okay, what can I do to support you? How can we collectively figure out what's going on as a group? And just one other thing I just want to throw out there, because my platform this year is social emotional learning. I feel like, We can have all the grade appropriate materials that we want, the strong instruction, the high expectations, but unless we address their social emotional skills as well, I don't think we're going to get that deep engagement. So we have to hit that as well.
Thank you, Joy. Dr. Blackburn?
Two things. One, assume not good intent on behalf of the teacher, but assume great intent on behalf of the teacher. And number two, use whatever influence you have, wherever you are, to de-emphasize things like teacher supervision and punitive teacher evaluation, and reinvigorate instructional support, resources, and mentorship.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you all again for the panel. I definitely encourage all of you, you have the executive summary. Go on our website, tntp.org, and download the full report. Feel free to share with your colleagues, with friends, and just ask us any questions. And I think we're going to turn it over to Christina. Thank you all so much.